kids, and welcome to the Styles Rumble Arm Extravaganza tutorial rigging guide thing in harmony. Today's episode is going to be more about our arm friend. Here we have our arm friend, and I've just left two nubs here, and we're going to talk a little bit about patching up this elbow. Previously, we talked about the nub patch, which is just keeping this as a flat edge. Beep beep, and then we can turn it and it kind of patches all by itself. It's not the only way to elbow. I'm going to show you a few different ways that I've come across over the years of rigging. First thing I'm going to do, grab a little template drawing that I've already figured out. I'm going to use my ASDF script and call this patch. You may need to add a drawing down here and add a drawing and then add a peg and then set up your preferences. Whatever you gotta do, just get yourself a new drawing and we're gonna hook it up. Now we want to get rid of this elbow mess. So we're gonna keep this little nubby bit. We're not gonna block it off. Instead we're going to use a little independent patch, the old indie patch, and we're gonna hook it up to the upper arm. And I'll show you why. Up here, the animation, the green cord is going from the upper arm to our little indie patch. And the blue cord, or the visual cord, is going to poop it out in front of the lower arm. And this is a fairly simple way and sort of an old-fashioned way of doing it. We're just going to draw in a little patch like this and hide our line. And there you go. Our little indie patch is there. We can give it its very own pivot point. In fact, I'm going to put the pivot point over here and I'll show you why. Now, I've decided to hook it up to our upper arm because, as you can see, when it moves, it makes sense that it would move with that. If we were to hook it up to our lower arm, it's just not doing it for me. You get this, that's hideous. That's why we hook it up to the upper arm. And now we can bend our arm up like this. And now if we want to taper it, because I've put the pivot point over here, we can kind of shimmy it around here and squeak out a little bit of a taper. So it's not as square, not as blunt as our previous line was. I think that looks pretty nice. So the indie patch is another viable method if we decide to put our lower arm behind our upper arm. I'm going to use my concordance control points menu because I like to be very super precise. Now our patch isn't working for that. So that's the downside to the indie patch. We could animate our guy around and, muck about like this to do it. Or we could put in a second indie patch, STF, patch 2, and that one could be controlled by the lower arm. Do something like that and make sure it's in the very front. One forward. We have to pop it forward again to make sure that it's ahead in the Z axis. Because remember, it's ordering in terms of left to right, but it's also ordering with the Z information. And because it's connected to the lower arm, the patch itself is going to be moved back as well. So we'd have to counter animate it forward. But it works, and then you could animate it if you wanted in this case, we'd want our arm to go like that because it's behind the body. Okay, so that's the indie patch. If you need something that goes behind, then you're going to need two separate patches like this, and then you would expose the one you need at the time, so you could turn that one off. So when you switch this back to its original position, you can turn this one back on. So you can see that has its advantages and disadvantages. It's an animatable thing that you can have a little bit of control over. You can add drawing substitutions to change the look of the patch if you need different stuff for different angles. For tapers, for example, if you needed something that tapered this way because your show has a specific look that they need, or it's a very close-up shot and you need to be very precise about how these things are tapered, then that's an option. And you can add as many patches as you need for different views and stuff like that. For me, I just think it's a little unwieldy because then animators have to remember, okay, when this is in this position, then this patch needs to be on. And when this is in another position, then we need to switch to this patch. So a similar way to do this, which is a little bit more studio friendly, is to take this patch off its independent node and add it to the drawing that's controlling it here. So in this case, we're going to use the upper arm, and we're going to paste it into the overlay layer. Boop. And my arm itself is on the line, so this is above it, because just like these have its hierarchy left, right, Z, these are always going to be displayed overlay, line, color, underlay, unless you force it to do otherwise. So I'm going to delete that patch. I'm going to delete our second patch. Now we want this overlay to be in front of the lower arm. I'm going to haul in my layer selectors from my library because I have them set up as a template just the way I like it, but you can get them from your node library. If you remember from our previous video, you have the generic layer selector here. I have it in my favorites, but you can just type in layer selector into your search here and you'll get underlay, overlay, layer selector, whichever one you want to do. Here I'm going to take my overlay that I've got set up and I'm going to plug it in above my arm. Now you can see that it works exactly like the independent patch, except when we change this drawing to another version, it's going to disappear. If we want to have an arm that goes in the back, we could have a front arm on one and a back arm on two. You can rename each of these drawings. So here you can right click drawing, rename drawing, use your hotkey Control D, and it'll pop up here, and you could say front. So then the animator can see, okay, this is the front, this is the back, and it'll have the appropriate patches that you need. You can also rename things in your X sheet. Here, it's a little bit easier to see all of them lined up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you rename this front, back, side, whatever, you could read them all. So you'd be able to read all of your different things in your X sheet. That's kind of convenient. If we want this overlay to be able to move independently, that's also doable. We'll copy and paste, which makes a clone of our drawing. And we discussed clones before. So you know this is an identical copy in every way. If we draw on this layer, it will affect this layer. And all we need to do is add an extra peg in here and give it a pivot point. So now this is also an animatable patch, just like our previous independent patch was. The only thing is you'll get this big bounding box because all of the information is still living on here. We have our overlay. And you can see it'll actually smush the other drawings in it, but it's not visible because only the overlay is being pooped out here. Now, because we are animating these separately, we are going to want to separate this one as well because it already has an overlay on it. So I'm going to copy and paste my overlay layer because these are safe modules to copy. And I'm going to call this one no overlay. It's fast to type, and then I'm just going to select every single layer except the overlay. This version of the clone does not contain the overlay, and this one does, so they're animated independently, and both have separate visual information, but when we change the drawing substitutions, they change together. Fabulous! Love the node system. And we could do exactly the same thing for our lower arm if we need that. Just copy the steps exactly, add an overlay. We can copy and paste our overlay no overlay, like this. And then we just draw in whatever little patch we need on the overlay layer. Boop, we'll pretend this is exactly what we want. We make a clone, put it in here, add a separate peg, and now this one is also independently animatable. It can have a front, side, back view, whatever, however many you need with the appropriate things in here, and it's ready to go. That's our little not so independent patch, a dependent patch. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use bees. We're not going to use bees. We're going to use our auto patch that we learned all about in our Bits and Bytes 2 episode, which I will link somewhere on the screen if I can figure out how to do that with the technology. Okay, so obviously this is recorded at a different time. I rewatched the video and I just kind of rambled on into a big mess after this point, just in case anybody notices that it's like a huge disruption. So we've got our auto patch tree setup done with our separating these onto our line and color layers. Now it just becomes a hodgepodge of playing with these layers in different ways to try and get this working out the way we expect it to. We're going to need our auto patch, and we're also going to need a cutter. And remember that we want this lower arm cut by the upper arm to get rid of this dude here. So we want our visual information to be pooped out on the right from the lower arm, and then we want our upper arm to cut the lower arm. Now because the upper arm comes down to a nub as well. If you move this, you can see it's just cutting it directly. What we want to do is not use this line part here. And because the color art extends past the line art, you can see if we just switch back and forth real fast that the line art's coming out, extending here to this stroke. Then if we separate the layer itself, so if we just put the color art in like that, we're going to get a little bit of the line anyway because it does extend a little farther than the color art. That's one of the issues with the line stroke thing. So knowing this, Toonboom put in this auto patch, which I described in the Bits and Bytes episode. that cleans this up. So this is acting more like we'd expect it to because it's only cutting to the seam of where the color art and the line art meet. Of course, with everything, there are issues. If I render this, you can see that it actually doesn't cut that precisely because there's a little bit of a disconnect between where the line starts. Like that little seam is not quite perfect, and we can end up getting stuff like this. So there's a whole pile of different ways to fix that by separating out these layers, the arm layers. I'm going to create a composite and call it C just to make it small. I'm going to connect my arm to this C instead. I'm going to use my line layer selector so that the line is coming out here. And I'm going to use my color so the color is coming out here. So both of these are just coming out exactly the same way, except they're being separated using these modules. Now I can use my cutter on just the line art, and we are going to clean up that seam there by doing that. Another way, if we were to cut the whole thing like this, getting this seam, is to plug the color art in behind. So we wouldn't need this line art layer. We can separate the color art from our line art, and of course we wouldn't need a composite for that, and just put the color art in again behind the line and color, just the full strength arm here, just peep it in behind, and that'll also clean up that seam. So that's two different ways of solving the same problem. In some situations, so I've just undid back to this here, where it's cutting both the line and the color. So in some situations, a matte resize will help this sort of thing. So in this instance, the auto patch is just a little bit too big. It's like a pixel or so too big. So we can put in a matte resize at minus 0.02, maybe minus 0.03, and it's starting to clean up the seam. But in this instance, it's also causing a problem here. There's also kind of a funny fix if you have something that's a little bit too small and you need it to be bigger. So in this case, we need the color art to be bigger. You could actually plug that in over and over and over again, like this, and you can see it's getting a little bit nuts, but it is cleaning up that seam just by poofing up the color art in here. And I've actually seen this done in a studio. There are some places where they'll just plug something in 20 times to make it just a little bit bigger to fix these seam problems. So just because it's messy or hideous doesn't mean it's the worst idea. I think I go over it a little more in the Bits and Bytes episode where the matte resize used to have scaling problems. So this would actually save that problem, like it would fix it. If you're using an older version of Harmony or Animate Pro 2, something like a little bit older, this will work better for you than a matte resize will. It'll still do the same thing, it'll just bulk it up a tiny bit at a time. But if it scales, it's going to scale appropriately. So just one of those sneaky insider tips to help you with your issues. For argument's sake, let's say we decide just to cut the line art. The downside is we're not getting any overlap. And in fact, that's a bigger issue than it appears at first, because if we pull our arm all the way up here, there's literally no overlap at all. So it's going to just demolish this line. One solution is we can actually separate this arm a little bit more. So right now we have line and color art. I'm going to create an overlay. Boop. And that's this line, this guy up here, the overlay. And I'm going to take the arm art and I'm going to paste it on the overlay art. Now I can kind of shorten it a little bit. And when the arm goes in front, it has a line there. We can actually go further and create a taper on this. So we have a little bit of a taper. And then when we pull it out, it will show the line below the overlay art, and it'll square it up again. So it's just a little sneaky overlay with this tapered line hidden on our overlay art. Another way is let me just go into my drawing view so I can see what I'm doing. Instead of putting all of this on my overlay, what I'm going to do is put the nub part on the overlay. So it's this part down here that I'm adding, and now instead of cutting the line, I'm going to cut the overlay. So here our line is just a little bit ugly. We can just tidy that up a bit. Seam lines up with our overlay seam a little better. And now instead of cutting the line, it's cutting the overlay, but we're getting a very similar situation. Now we can't get the taper as well, so I think this is not quite as good as the previous example, but it does serve the same purpose. It'll work if you're not a real big line snob like I am. You just won't have that little bit of a taper, or you could add in drawing substitutions and put in tapers that way. So you can see there are a lot of different ways to solve the same problem, which is kind of why I avoided the rigging one character situation, because there's not one solution that is better than any of the others. It really depends on what you need this elbow to do. Do you need taper lines? Do you need squared lines? If you need it so that this doesn't overlap at all, like maybe you have that sort of a style, then just cutting the line art like this with the auto patch, that if that's the look you're going for, then I mean that does work. You can see this little issue is because we've separated this arm previously. So my overlay, switch it down to my line, and then it'll clean that up. So if you need no seams, you can do that. If you need an overlap, a very nice tapered overlap, then you could put in an overlay that works whatever way you need it to work, okay? It's all just problem solving, finding the best solution for the look you want. So for argument's sake, we'll say I decide this is the one I like best, where I have a tapered line on my overlay art. So here's my overlay art. This is where the wrist is. It's like this. Then this is my line art, is the full loop, and then my color art is just the fill. So I decide this is the one I like the best. It has a tapered line. That makes me happy. But then when it comes out, it fills it in. Sold. Now I want to do that for the upper arm as well, because if this arm goes behind, and we'll do this 0001 back, boop, and he's all the way in the back. Now, I would like my upper arm to have the appropriate overlap as well. So because I know that this system is working well for my lower arm, I can assume it will work well for my upper arm. I can just copy all of these modules and paste them over here, because all of these dark blue modules and our composite are safely pasted. Now I'm going to plug my composite in where my arm is. So I can just click on my arm and control click on my new composite, and I can make sure they're plugged into the right place, because sometimes these can get quite far away from each other, so it's easier to be able to drag these down and see where they're going. Now I'm going to plug in my upper arm the same way as my lower arm. So I'm going to unplug it from the general comp and plug it into the overlay, the line, and the color. And my auto patch, I know I want to cut from my lower arm, so I'm going to pull my lower arm over to my auto patch. So if you open up a scene and your character's arms look like this, I totally understand that that could be terrifying. And you're just like, what does this mean? But hopefully when you see me build this up a little bit at a time, it's a little less frightening. Like it makes more sense. Like you don't start off being like, oh, I need 6 modules for this, dump in the 6 modules, and then just know automatically where to plug it in. It's a logical thought process. Like, okay, I started with my lower arm. I want to separate the line from the color. That didn't quite work out, so I'm going to add the overlay, and it builds up over time. And of course, the rigs can start getting very, very complex, but they don't start out that way. It is a building block process. All right, so now we know our overlay is going to need overlay line color, and we can always reference our lower arm that's working. We know the overlay has the tapered line, line has the full one, and the color has the colored one. So this is working fine. For these two, these are both working as intended. We just need to add this overlay, and then we think to ourselves, how do we want this to overlap? So I would like to cut this here, and then the taper would be on this side. I'm gonna bring it down like that. Okay, so now we get that overlap is working great for this. And let's reset our arm and see if this is still working. And it is. Good. If you add something to the other part of the arm, obviously you need to check to make sure that you haven't destroyed the thing you've done before. This is not an uncommon way to see arms done. I think it works great. I like having this tapered line built in, and it's very it looks a lot nicer, in my opinion, than a squared off line. But of course, as I mentioned before, I am a line snob. All right, so I want you to start thinking about different ways that you could break up these layers. You could just come up with like a simple arm setup. You don't even need the hand or anything. You can just deactivate all this stuff. You don't need a sleeve. You can just have this much of an arm and just play around with different ways that you can come up with to make sure that this arm looks exactly like you'd want it to look, or different styles that you'd want to do. You could even, if you're really brave, try and come up with a way that there's no line art unless this crosses this threshold. That's a fun thing to do. I'll pop that into the next video because there's more ways to do arms. I'm not done, kids. There's so many ways, and I'm sure there's more than I could even possibly come up with myself. I keep having to reiterate that there's no right way, just the way that works for your production, whether it's your independent production at home and it's a way that only you can understand, or whether it's a big studio or working with dozens of people and you have to have something that's very clearly communicated to lots of people, especially baby animators. I always try and rig to the newest kid. I like to create rigs that are very user friendly. If someone doesn't understand how all this stuff works, I want them to be able to just pop in and be able to use it right out of the box, because you don't need to know what any of this stuff does to animate this. You bend it, it has a nice tapered line, you don't know where it's coming from, doesn't matter, you can use it. So I like this solution, not quite as much as the nub solution, because I feel like that's the most user-friendly and most utilitarian option, especially if you have a show that uses a lot of redraw. If you need to redraw a bunch of stuff and you have this many different layers, teaching baby animators to use that is going to be a much steeper learning curve. A few episodes in, people will start to be able to do it, but it's not really fresh out of the box. You can just pop in and start redrawing stuff, okay? All right, so more arms next time. Thanks for dropping by. If you know anybody who'd stand to learn a little bit more about Harmony, please share, like, subscribe, all those things internet people ask you to do. Thanks for dropping by, and I'll see you in the next video with the arms. So many arms.